Some of you perhaps know what happened 100 years ago today. On November 7th, 1917, a small group of political radicals seized power in the capital of the Russian Empire and proceeded to create the Soviet Union. My name is Bradley Woodworth, and I teach history here at the University of New Haven. And I'm very glad to see so many people here today. For helping us make this event possible, I want to thank the Office of the Dean of Arts and Sciences. Thank you. The Division of Social Sciences and Humanities. Paulette, thank you. And the National Security Department of the Henry C. Lee College. We are exceedingly fortunate to have with us as a guest to the University of New Haven, Timothy Snyder. One of this country's leading historians and public intellectuals. That is, an expert, a knower, but not someone who knows on a narrow scale only, rather someone whose words explore and wrestle with the central issues of our time, issues that affect us all. The title of his talk today is Russian Counter-Revolutionary Thought, a Century After the Revolution. Timothy Snyder is the Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale University and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. His doctoral degree is from the University of Oxford, and before joining the faculty at Yale in 2001, he held fellowships in Paris, Vienna, Warsaw, and an institution up the coast, Harvard University. Professor Snyder is the author of a whole list of award-winning books. Here I'll mention just a few of them. The Reconstruction of Nations, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, 1569 to 1999. This is published in 2003. The Red Prince, The Secret Lives of a Habsburg Archduke, 2008. Then Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin in 2010. And Black Earth, The Holocaust as History and Warning, published in 2015. These last two books, there's one more I will mention in a moment. These last two books that I just mentioned each have been translated into more than 30 languages each. They've been read around the world. Professor Snyder has also written for leading publications including the New York Review of Books, Foreign Affairs, the Times Literary Supplement, the New Republic, as well as for the New York Times, the International Herald Tribune, and the Wall Street Journal. I also want to point out that this very year, 2017, Professor Snyder received the Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship, and he has received orders of state as recognition and thanks for his work from the countries of Estonia, Lithuania, and Poland. Professor Snyder's most recent book is a small one. I think a number of you have already read it. I know I've distributed some copies across campus. It's titled On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, published just earlier this year. As I read the book, I find in it a deep faith in who we are as Americans and as people. Thomas Jefferson wrote these words in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I made one small addition, one I think there's little doubt that Jefferson would want us to add today. Jefferson believed in us and was convinced that basic human rights simply exist, and that we can use human reason to solve problems and make our lives better. We are still pursuing these rights, still trying to defend them, and working to ensure we will continue to keep them. We as Americans are still overcoming our failures to see everyone as equal. Many of our fellow Americans experienced slavery. This is what the American Civil War was about. Our broader Western civilization, of which we are a part, suffered immensely in the 20th century at the hands of leaders of regimes who put ideologies over human beings. The communists in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the fascists in Nazi Germany and elsewhere. On this point, Professor Snyder has this to say in this most recent book. We might be tempted to think that our democratic heritage automatically protects us from such threats. This is a misguided reflex. Americans today are no wiser than the Europeans who saw democracy yield to fascism, Nazism, or communism in the 20th century. Our one advantage is that we might learn from their experience. Now is a good time to do so. Timothy Snyder, welcome to the University of New Haven, and thank you very much for coming to speak to us today.
Thank you very much, Brad. It's a pleasure to have Bradley Woodworth as a friend and as a colleague. It's a really great pleasure to see all of you here today, especially all of you who are, in fact, students. Whatever bribes and incentives have been put in place, I do not wish to know about them, right? Leave me in my state of innocent happiness. Nobody breathe a word. It's a sincere pleasure, in all seriousness, to see so many of you young people here today, because what I want to try to do is talk about time. Talk about the way that history works, talk about the ways that we think about time that put us into history, or the ways that we think about time that take us out of history, take us out of a sense of responsibility, take us out of a sense of agency, take us out of a sense of thinking that what we do matters, or that we're part of something larger. The thesis, and I'm going to say it now in case I don't get back around to it by the end, the thesis, and it's very close to what Brad said, is that history is freedom and that freedom is history. If you understand where you are in the past, if you can get through the various illusions that tell you things have to be the way they are, or that the same thing happens over and over again, if you can get through that, if you can see what the structures actually are, what the limits actually are, then you can see what you can actually do. And the moment that you see what those limits are, what those structures are, is also the moment when you can't avoid taking responsibility for the way things are, because you see it for what it is. So I want to begin by reflecting on the idea of anniversaries as such. I mean, there's a reason why we're all here today, and the reason is that it is exactly 100 years from the Bolshevik Revolution. What does it mean that it's exactly 100 years? Why does that matter to us? Does that have anything to do with history? Now, I don't want you to all to leave when I say this, but I don't think it actually does. I think that we've fallen into this habit of not thinking about history, but instead remembering, commemorating, making loops back around, nodding our heads at things that we know we're supposed to acknowledge are important, but not thinking about history as a continuity, not thinking about where we are in this bigger flow. And what I want to do is suggest that that's not necessarily innocent, that there's something strange, maybe something even pagan, about celebrating and remembering these round numbers. This odd habit we have of deciding that things only matter when we're on a 100-year anniversary or a 50-year anniversary of something. What I want to suggest is that there are ways of thinking about time which keep you in your seats. There are ways of thinking about time which prevent you from actually doing anything. And those ways of thinking about time have a lot to do with this Bolshevik Revolution, and also to do with the counter-revolution which I think is going on now. So my big subject, if I get to it, is going to be a counter-revolutionary thinker called Ivan Ilyin. But before we get to counter-revolution and revolution, I've got to give you a sense of what I mean by all this time business. So I'm going to give you two ideas of time. One idea of time is the idea of progress, right? This is the idea that we mistakenly, I think, have raised you in. This idea that things automatically get better, that we know what the future is going to be. The future is going to be like the present, just more of the same good stuff that we have in the present, right? That inevitably things are going to be better. There is a capitalist version of this, which is the version in which you were raised. You can correct me and tell me your parents told you something different or your professors tell you something different, but this is basically what American culture has said since 1989. The idea is that, okay, there's nature, and since there's nature, there's the market, and since there's the market, there's democracy, and therefore everything is honky-dory, right? That's basically been the American credo for the last 25 years. It's wrong in every particular, completely unjustified, and has led to a great deal of harm. But what I'm trying to say is that it is a species of a general way of thinking about time, which says that there's only one pattern, there's only one line of development, there's only one way that things can go, and the cost of that is that there are many costs of that. But one cost of that is that it doesn't matter what any of you do individually, right? Because we know the general rules. Now, Marxism-Leninism was a similar idea, right? So the capitalists and the communists like to square off and say, oh, we're so very different and we had 100 years of ideological warfare. Fine. But there's a way in which Marxism-Leninism was similar in structure to that idea. The way that Marxism-Leninism was similar, the way that the idea of the Bolshevik Revolution was similar, was that it too proclaimed that there is only one pattern of time. We know how the past is going into the future, right? Their story was different. Their story was, since there's nature, there's technology. Since there's technology, there are classes. Since there are classes, there are class conflict. Class conflict is going to lead to socialism. That is a different story, but it follows the same pattern, right? History as inevitability. And in that story, right? In that story, you don't matter. I don't matter. It's not you. It's all me too. Nobody matters in that story because that story invokes larger historical forces. That story is determinist. It's about knowing what's going to happen already, whether it's a capitalist version or whether it's a communist version. So what happened in the United States, and if there's time, I'm going to get back to the United States by the end. But what happened in the United States is that after communism came to an end, right? After communism came to an end, Americans said, well, the communist story was wrong, and therefore our story was right. And that's been essentially how we've gone about things for the last 25 years. And now that's breaking up before our eyes. Why am I dwelling on all this? I'm dwelling on this because if we see the ideas of time that are around us, that's the only way we have a chance of breaking ourselves free of them. And what tends to happen is that these happy stories of progress, whether it's a communist story of progress or a capitalist story of progress, these happy stories of progress tend to break at a certain point. And what I want to suggest is that we're in that breaking point now, that by a nice coincidence, 100 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, we are in a moment of counter-revolution. And by an even nicer coincidence, at least for the purposes of this talk, the leading counter-revolutionary thinker, I think, in the world happens to be a Russian who was reacting to the Bolshevik Revolution. And the kind of thinking, we'll get more into the details of this, but the kind of thinking that happens when ideas of progress break or are notions of doom. You go from everything is going to go very well to everything is going to go very badly. You go from we have a story of how history is supposed to move forward to a story of how the same bad thing happens over and over and over again, right? So that's that, and that sort of story has a philosophy, and that philosophy is a philosophy of counter-revolution. Now, why does Russia matter so much? Why is it that you can't turn on well, I don't know what you watch on television. Do you even watch do you know what a television is? Okay, cool. So why is it that you can't turn on Why is it that you can't turn on television without hearing about Russia? Why is America all about Russia? America is all about Russia now because Russia, philosophically, politically, got to the place where we're going faster than we did. Got there first. Russians made this shift from everything has to go well to everything has to go badly before we did. And now that they're already there, they're doing a pretty good job of helping us along the way to becoming more like them. So how did they get there? Why did they get to this politics of this bad thing, this doom? I'm going to call it the politics of eternity. The idea that the same thing happens over and over again, this counter-revolutionary idea, I'm going to call it the politics of eternity. How did they get to this politics of eternity before we did? I mean, aren't we always supposed to be first, even with bad stuff? So how did they get there first? Here we have to get into Soviet history. Marxism-Leninism was a story of progress until it was not. Okay? It was a story of progress until the Second World War. During the Second World War, Stalin said something extremely interesting, which is this. Stalin in the Second World War said, the pain and the suffering that it took to create the Soviet Union, that is no longer about the great socialist future. The millions of people that I starved, okay, he didn't put it that way. You will not find Stalin saying the millions of people I starved. The millions of people who starved, the millions of people who died as a result of Soviet policy, says Stalin, that is all justified because we won the Second World War. Okay? So in the middle of the 20th century, about 25 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, Stalin changes the script and says all of this suffering, it wasn't about a utopia in the future. All of this suffering was about beating the Germans in the Second World War. That is a very different story. Then, 30 years on, one of his successors, Brezhnev, finishes off the Bolshevik Revolution as a story of progress. In the 1970s, Leonid Brezhnev, General Secretary of the Soviet Union, he completes that story by saying the following. He says, look, the most important thing about the history of the Soviet Union is not the revolution. The most important thing about the history of the Soviet Union is the victory in the Second World War. Now, why is that so important? Because the revolution was always a story about the future. The revolution was always promising something better in the future. In the 1970s, Brezhnev opts for nostalgia. Brezhnev says the thing which matters is our victory in 1945. The thing which matters is your parents and your grandparents. This changes the whole structure of Soviet ideology because now no longer is a bright future being promised. What Brezhnev talks about is really existing socialism, which is just as much fun as it sounds like. What Brezhnev is saying is that the thing that you have around you is as good as it's ever going to get. There is no utopia coming. This is actually people, despite the fact that you have no cars and your apartments are tiny and you live with them with 3 other families, nevertheless, this is as good as it's going to get. This is socialism. And what we're going to think about is our glorious victory in the Second World War. We're going to turn to nostalgia. This has a lot to do with the fact that Soviet industrial growth has basically stopped. This has a lot to do with the fact that Soviet leaders are no longer killing each other, and therefore leaders are much older, right? I mean, I don't think I'm hiding anything from you when I say that 40 years down the line, you too will be nostalgic. You'll look back and talk about how the University of New Haven were the best years of your life. No, sociological research actually shows this, right? So, no, we now have the polling about when America was great. So the political scientists have done the polling about when America was great. And so, make America great again, you have to first know when America was great. And it turns out that America is great when individual Americans were teenagers, right? That's when America was great, which has interesting implications for policy. Because in order to make America great again, we have to be able to make everybody who's 65, 15. Which, of course, for a lot of the boomers, I think is not much of a problem. But that's kind of my generation. All right. So what we're talking about is how Russia gets this idea of history as eternity first. That in the 70s, Brezhnev basically does away with the promise of the revolution and says, look back to the Second World War, when we were defending ourselves against the West. Look back to the Second World War. That's the real story. And this is important because the people who run Belarus and the people who run Russia grew up in that. That's the story that they grew up in. Less a promise of the future, more a notion of defending Russia or the Soviet Union from this West. Defending Russia or the Soviet Union from this threat which comes around over and over and over again. And then in the 90s, while you were still just whatever, were you alive? No. Okay, so then in the 90s, when you were not even a glimpse of anything, in the 90s, when the Americans were in their end of history, there are no alternatives, rah-rah moment. Right? After the end of communism in Eastern Europe in '89, the end of communism in the Soviet Union in '91, basic American move was to say, well, their story was wrong, our story was right, capitalism leads to democracy, and so on. The Russians go through that very quickly. Right? The Russians have unrestrained and highly politicized privatization, which leads to massive wealth inequality and the general discreditation of the ideas of both capitalism and democracy by the mid-1990s. Russia goes through a massive health crisis. The average lifespan of males in Russia goes way down, like in the US now. There's a massive problem with alcoholism in Russia, not so unlike the opioid crisis right now. And basically the upshot is that by the end of the 90s, nobody in Russia believes the happy capitalist story either. So both versions of progress are done for by the end of the 90s in Russia, which means that Russian leaders have to build up a different story. They have to build up a story about how it's good that nothing can change. And what is that nothing that can't change in Russia? The thing that can't change in Russia is tremendous wealth concentration. That's the thing that can't change. Oligarchy, which is a great word, which we have from the Greeks, right? And we have from the Greeks, but the Russians thoughtfully brought it back in the 1990s. Oligarchy meaning rule by the rich few. And that word goes from ancient Greece to Russia for very good reason. And then it comes from Russia to the United States for equally good reason, because there is one country in the world where rates of economic inequality are approaching the Russian standard, and that one country is the United States of America, right? And linguistic use follows that. We now also talk about oligarchy in this country for good reason. But, so my point is, let's say by 2012, when Vladimir Putin comes back to become president for the third time, it's kind of hard to keep count, right? Because he had 2 terms of 4 years, and then he was prime minister, and now there are going to be 2 terms of 6 years, and it just keeps going on, and after that he's going to be commander for life, and there's going to be like the epaulets, and it's going to be awesome. But when Vladimir Putin came back for his 3rd term in 2012, by that point, Russia is developing an ideology which explains why it is in fact good that a few people have so much of the national wealth. Of course, that's not what the ideology says. No decent ideologist is ever going to stand up and say, it is good that these 7 people in the front row have all the money and the rest of you don't. You're never quite that straightforward about it. You need something which is much more substantial, and that is where counter-revolutionary thought comes in, and that is where this man, Ivan Ilyin, comes in. And this is the figure who I want to introduce. Now, Ivan Ilyin has the distinction of being the only major political thinker. You can correct me in Q&A if you can think of other examples, because you may know other examples from other parts of the world. But in the parts of the world that I know, this is the only major political thinker to have been revived in the 21st century, right? Like somebody who was forgotten in the 20th and brought back in the 21st. And by brought back, I mean really brought back. Like all of his publications, he died in 1954. All of his publications are republished in Russian in the early 90s. Vladimir Putin himself doesn't physically bring back the body, I don't want to overstate it, but he arranges for the corpse to be disinterred in Switzerland and brought back to Russia, which that does not happen to that many philosophers, right? Like in these days of zombies and mummies and all this stuff in the popular culture, you might think that, when people talk about the founding fathers, I always think about that, right? Like what it would be like, what would it be like if the founding fathers actually came back? But okay, no, I mean, like we assume that they'll just be in like the same form, but they wouldn't. I mean, it's been like 250 years, right? So like they would be in some kind of zombified, mummified form if they, anyway. But so, no, I'm just trying to get at the weirdness of digging people up and bringing them back, because when I say they dug him up and brought them back, you're just like, oh yeah, that's normal, we do that. No, we don't do that all the time, right? The number of philosophers who have been disinterred and then buried in another country is actually very limited. The archives of this man were at Michigan State, where they were happily sitting and nobody was reading them, and now they're in Russia, where they're happily sitting and nobody can read them. That was 2006. Putin began to cite him in his annual addresses to the General Assembly of the Russian Parliament in 2005. Basically, every important Russian politician then begins to cite this man, Ivan Ilyin. If you were a civil servant in Russia, you got a copy of this for Christmas, and a copy of Ilyin's writings, 2014. If you were a regional governor, ditto. If you're a member of Russia's one party, you also got copies of this book. Okay, I'm just trying to say that this thinker was brought back, because there's always this question of like, well, can a thinker really matter? And why do we always ask that? Because we're under the trance of this stupid, there are no alternatives, right? So we think every time, so like the Russians can jump up and down and say, hey, we're rehabilitating this fascist, we dug him up, we reprinted his works, and they can do this for a decade. And the way that we respond is we say, oh, well, that's just pragmatism, right? Because ideas don't really matter, because there are really no alternatives. But there are alternatives, right? This is an alternative kind of thinking which comes back to Russia, and now which is, if I have time, I'm going to say how it comes back to us. Okay, so what was this thinking? Let me briefly go over his career with a few landmarks, and then let me briefly try to give you an idea of what the philosophy was about. The career. He was, in his youth, like so many Russians who came of age in the first part of the 20th century, in his youth he was sympathetic with the left. As a result of the Bolshevik Revolution, he shifts quite far to the right. He becomes an enthusiast after 1922 for Benito Mussolini and Italian fascism. As a political immigrant, he lives in Berlin and works for the Prussian state as a scholar. And in 1933, he is also an enthusiast of Adolf Hitler. Elin's idea is that fascism is the only way forward for Europe and for the world, that Mussolini and Hitler are rescuing European civilization, that all Russians and all Europeans should follow in their example. And okay, I see you don't find this very shocking. I take this as like a sign of where we are in 2017, that I'm like, he thinks that Mussolini and Hitler are great. And you're like, oh yeah, of course he did. Like, doesn't everybody think that Mussolini and Hitler are great? You know, does this not strike you? I mean, does it not strike you that it doesn't strike you? You're like, oh yes, of course, everybody's rehabilitating Mussolini. I've heard of Steve Bannon. Okay, so all right, so the so as an immigrant, he is a supporter of a kind of consistently of a kind of Christian fascism. First as an immigrant in Berlin, and then as an immigrant in Switzerland. How does the philosophy work? And this is kind of the intellectually interesting part, because part of seeing that there are alternatives, or part of watching this shift, which we are all in together, from ideas of inevitability to ideas of eternity, is realizing that there has to be some kind of a guide. There do have to be thinkers who help to get you from one place to the other. Elin was one of these thinkers, and here is how he thought. Elin's idea of Christianity was that God tried to create the world, but that was a bad idea. God made a mess of it. All of the things that God created in the earth were mistakes. Individual human beings should not exist. The way that we experience life, by apprehending facts and by experiencing passions, by which he meant basically love, experiencing facts and passions is inherently sinful. The only good thing in the world was God's totality. So God, in making the world, broke himself, created a broken universe, and also discredited himself. What does that mean? That means that the work of restoring God, or the work of restoring divine totality, the only good thing in the universe, was left to men. In particular, it was left to Elin personally as the only person who understood that this was the actual state of affairs. But there was hope, and the hope was Russia. And now this will start to sound familiar to those of you who study Russian language or Russian culture. Russia, says Elin, has somehow escaped the sinful character of the world and the sinful character of the universe. Russia has preserved, underneath the appearances of the world, it's preserved divine totality. Russia is going to be the place that actually restores the world and restores the universe and restores God. How is Russia going to do this? And now these are the writings that are most popular in Russia today. How is Russia going to do this? Russia is going to do this thanks to a redeemer, thanks to a man, a single fascist leader, who emerges from somehow from beyond history. A fictional character who bears within himself the possibility of bringing the entire Russian nation together. This fictional character will overcome the world of facts and passions. That seems difficult, right? But it only seems difficult to you. Does it seem difficult to overcome the world of facts and passions? Or I'm just wondering, no, because I don't know how far totalitarianism has actually gone, right? Like at every lecture, I feel like I should like put my finger on the pulse of totalitarianism today. So like if you think facts and passions can be overcome, I want to know, right? Partly because I want to know like which exit I should take as I flee screaming from this. So the project is that a single leader will put Russia into an order, right? We'll turn Russia into what Elin calls an organic whole. The structure of the Russian polity, says Elin, will be like this. This redeemer who somehow comes from off stage and miraculously appears, and miraculously is the right word, somehow comes from off stage and miraculously appears, this redeemer will be a national dictator. He will be the leader of the entire people. He will have all executive, judiciary, and legislative power. He'll be the commander of the armed forces. Russia will be a centralized state. It will all be about this one person. There will be elections, says Elin, but the elections are just a ritual of support of this one person. So there will be voting, but the voting will not be in secret. The voting will be public. And just to be sure, everyone should sign the ballot, right, to make sure you're voting for the leader. And society will be organized as a kind of organism. That's a word that Elin uses a lot, organism. The idea is that Russia is an innocent or a virginal organism. And the way that Russia is organized like a body is that the leader will be on top. And here's where things get interesting. The middle classes will be on the bottom. Now, that sounds like a contradiction because it is. The reason that the middle classes are called the middle classes is that you can rise through the middle classes, or if it's America in 2017, you can fall through the middle classes, right? The middle classes are in the middle for a reason. What Eileen is saying is that the middle classes, this very idea of mobility, is the same thing as individuality. If you imagine that you can move in life, that after graduation you will do something different than what you're doing now, right? If you can imagine that, that makes you an individual, and that's what we cannot have. Therefore, the middle classes have to be at the bottom, under everyone else, crushed by everyone else, because it's the middle classes who make ideas of individuality possible, and that's what we cannot have. Now, it's Russia says, so what is the leader going to do? What should policy actually be? Policy then becomes foreign policy, okay? And you see how this now maps on to the way Russia actually is today, or for that matter, other countries. If the middle classes have to stay at the bottom, because that's the only way for Russia to be the holy organism that it is, that means that it's okay for the people who are on the top to stay on the top, right? If the Redeemer and his friends happen to have all the money, that's fine. That's good. That's the way that things ought to be. There can be no domestic policy as such, because domestic policy would mean moving things around inside Russia, which you can't have. What there can be is foreign policy, and indeed there has to be foreign policy, because according to Eileen, innocent Russia is constantly under threat from the malevolent rest of the world. And therefore Russia is always justified in carrying out wars against the rest of the world, because Russia, as Eileen says, is engaged in eternal self-defense. Russia suffers constantly from, Eileen says, a continental blockade, such that Russia, as Eileen writes, has experienced 1,000 years of historical suffering. Now, this version of the politics of eternity, which I've not tried to make it sound strange. I've actually tried to make it sound more normal than perhaps it is. These ideas, which may sound strange, or maybe they don't sound strange, these ideas are hauntingly close to actual Russian policy in the last couple of decades. The person who comes from nowhere and becomes the leader of the nation is, of course, Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is very much a kind of fictional creation, a person who was not known at all before he became prime minister and president, a leader who literally was chosen as the result of a casting call. The people who were around President Yeltsin were trying to choose who should be Yeltsin's successor, and the way that they did it was to ask themselves, which fictional character on Russian television is most popular? They carried out opinion polling about that. The most popular Russian character was a Soviet spy who spoke German, right? And hence they thought, aha, Vladimir Putin, who had been, as I'm sure you all know, in the KGB in East Germany. So he was literally chosen after a casting call. He was completely unknown, or almost completely unknown, when he became president. The way that he has remained in power are ritualized elections, which is how, by the way, authoritarianism works now. It's very rarely the case that an authoritarian regime says, okay, now we're not going to have elections. What happens instead is that each election is a little bit less democratic than the election before, right? So for example, the elections of 2016 in the United States had just that much more voter suppression than the elections of 2014. You never know at what moment you're going to say, oh, that's not a democracy anymore, because it comes in stages. The elections never stop. They just become ever more ritualized. Likewise, the way that Russia is run in terms of the middle class, and especially in terms of civil society, is very similar to what Eileen recommended, that there shouldn't be mobility upwards, that the peak should remain at the peak. And in particular, and here's the idea which I think is most interesting. In particular, the idea that you maintain the Russian status quo by constant struggles with the world outside, right? There's no promise of improving things. There's no promise of moving Russia forward. That's impossible, right? What there is the constant spectacle of wars abroad, whether it's Ukraine or whether it's Syria. And in the case of the transition from the Russian invasion of Ukraine to the Russian bombing of Syria, it's really striking. In September 28th, 29th, 30th of 2015, all of the Russian media shifts as one from the spectacle of Ukraine to the spectacle of Syria. And basically like the same headlines, which would have had Ukraine in them one day, have Syria in them the next day. And that's because this idea that Russia is acting abroad in order to preserve its own virtue and to protect Russia from, from the sinful, decadent West, that it doesn't matter which country you're fighting, the idea turns out to be the same. Okay, so if this is right, okay, now, and I'm going to ask you now to step aside from what you might think are your own political convictions and so on. I'm happy to share my own, but this, think about now what is happening on the scale of the world. My premise is that we are shifting from one idea of time to another, from an idea of progress to an idea of doom. And my argument is that these ideas of doom have philosophers, and these ideas of doom can last. These ideas of doom can start to become normal. They can become the way that you actually process life. You can take them for granted, and you can shift from a world where you think, okay, I don't really have responsibility because everything's going fine, to a world which says, how could I possibly have responsibility because everything is going badly? You can shift from a world which says, we don't need to reform our country because in the final analysis, everything is going well, to a world which says, we can't reform our country because we're constantly under threat, right? That happens in Russia before it happens here. And this, I think, is crucial to understanding what is actually happening in the United States of America, and this is where I will close things down right now. So just for a moment, forget that you're American. If you're not American, this will be easy. Forget that you're American, right? Forget what you're thinking about how everything in America starts in America. Forget American exceptionalism. I mean, please, it's really helpful to let that go, at least for an experiment, for a moment, for an experiment, to let yourself think. Because the main thing that American exceptionalism does is it stops you from thinking, right? Try to drop all that for a moment. Think about this as one system. Think about us and the Russians together, and try to think about this vision of time. Because what is happening to us, I think, is that the Russians who had a guide into this politics of eternity are now helping us. They're now helping us get there, if helping is the right word. They're now helping us to make this transition from a world, like if you're a Republican, where you think, yeah, the market's going to bring the democracy and everything's going to be fine, or if you're a Democrat, you think, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice, which unfortunately is equally untrue. It's taking us away from these stories of how things are going to turn out well, towards stories of how things just have to be a constant emergency, right? So, let's not think of Donald Trump as a person, right? Let's think of, because I realize that a lot of us have strong feelings about him as a person, right? I can take him or leave him myself, but let's think about him instead as one of these fictional characters who help us make the transition from ideas of progress, from ideas of doom. Because what was the Russian intervention in American sovereignty? What was the character of the Russian intervention in our elections? It was precisely the creation of a fictional character where no one was there before, and then the successful implant of that fictional character into the top of the American system. Because there is no Donald Trump, successful businessman. That creature does not exist and never has existed. There once was a Donald Trump, failed businessman, billions of dollars of debt to 70 banks, completely uncreditworthy all across the Western world, who then received mysterious injections of cash from Russian actors, which allowed him to become fictional character Donald Trump on Celebrity Apprentice, portraying a successful businessman and firing people, which in real life he couldn't do because he didn't actually have a business from which he could fire people. Being a fictional character was what he was. On the basis of his fictional success, he then runs for the office of President of the United States, playing the character of a successful businessman. which he never was. The fact that he can pretend to be a successful businessman is entirely a result of the Russians who built his buildings, right? So you know what the Donald Trump business model was. The Russians gave him money. They put his name on a building, and they asked him to get out of the way, which is a good gig if you can get it, right? I wish I could stand in front of you and say, every graduate of the University of New Haven, when you finish, Russians will give you money, put your name on buildings, and ask you to get out of the way. Or if it's 2013, Russians will give you $20 million, run the Miss Universe pageant for you, and ask you to get out of the way, right? That is the nature of Donald Trump's career. From the beginning, this is a fictional character brought across the genre barrier into real life by Vladimir Putin, who was also, until he became president, a fictional character. What is the nature of the Russian intervention in American politics that allows this fictional character to be delivered to us by cyber war? Sure, there are people involved, right? Mr. Papadopoulos, who was recruited by the Russian Secret Services and is now confessed. Mr. Page, who was recruited by the Russian Secret Services and is now confessed. Mr. Manafort, who spent his entire career propping up dictators and who was paid millions of dollars by an oligarch close to the Kremlin to soften up American democracy for Russian influence. Mr. Flynn, who was paid by RT, a Russian propaganda sender. It goes on and on. I mean, it really doesn't stop. Steve Bannon, who is an admirer of Putin. Manafort, Kushner, Trump Jr. meeting in 2016 with Russians. Kushner with his multiple contacts with a sanctioned Russian bank. And it actually keeps going, right? Jeff Sessions perjuring himself in his confirmation hearings to the Attorney General of the United States, which is a sentence I wish I never had to say, perjuring himself in his confirmation hearings to the Attorney General of the United States about his contact with Russia. The Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross, always gets a pass, but he was one of the chairmen of a bank in Cyprus where Russian oligarchs launder their money. Even the Transportation Secretary, Elaine Chao, is the wife of Mitch McConnell, who in September 2016 said, hey, I don't really think there's actually any Russian intervention going on. It just goes on and on. Oh, and Trump himself, who signed a letter of agreement 5 months into his presidential campaign to have a Trump Tower built in Moscow, right? 5 months into the campaign, he lied about it, of course. 5 months into the presidential campaign, Mr. Trump himself, who from Trump Tower had a computer which was connecting to a computer from Alpha Bank. Mr. Trump himself, who fires Mr. Comey during the investigation, which is, I mean, wouldn't it be nice if we could all do that, right? I mean, there are an awful lot of young men in the United States who would be living entirely different lives if they could fire the police officers who were trying to arrest them, right? I mean, that's kind of a serious remark, actually. And then when he fired Mr. Comey, he then brought his friends over to the Oval Office and said, hey, I just fired the Comey and now the pressure is off and everything's great. And his friends were the Russian ambassador and the Russian foreign minister who had come to visit him and brought their digital gear. This is where we are. So there are the people, right? There are the people, but I think the people are not the essential thing. The essential thing is how a fictional character comes into our subjective life and eventually becomes real. The essential thing is the divide and fool, which is the Facebook campaign and the Twitter campaign and the Google campaign, which tells us just how divided we are and just how horrible it would be if someone besides Mr. Trump were president. The essential thing are the bots, right? So you guys know what bots are because they're your best friends, right? Like the bots that you convert to Christianity or you date or whatever they are. It turns out that in Brexit, in the British referendum about the European Union, 90% of the political communication about the issue in question communicated by bots came from countries besides Great Britain. The same thing is going to turn out to have been true in the United States in 2016. I don't know if it's going to be 90%, but a huge amount of the traffic, which was going across our Twitter feeds or Facebook feeds, is going to turn out to have an originating country which is not the United States of America. Which is, if that's cool with you, that's, it's not cool with me. But that's not, the thing is, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, it's worth knowing that most of the stuff to which you were exposed was put there to hurt you. This is a reality that I think we haven't yet confronted, and it led to the outcome that, and of course that was the timed release of email. Email released right before the Democratic National Convention. Email released half an hour after the Access Hollywood tape was released, in which Trump talked about pussy grabbing, half an hour afterwards. That's not a presidential campaign. That's having the intelligence services of a foreign power at your back. That's what that feels like, right? So this is what happened to us. And where we end up then, okay, I've talked about the politics of eternity, and this is where I'm going to end up. The politics of eternity are where we are headed now, or perhaps where we already are. What would the politics of eternity feel like in the United States? If you're in the politics of eternity in the United States, you might have people constantly looping back to the 1930s, like the Russians do. You might have someone like Stephen Bannon say that we're going to have policies, I'm quoting, as exciting as the 1930s. You might have a presidential slogan, which is America First. The content of America First in 1939 or 1940 is American citizens have more in common with Nazis than they have with the rest of the world. That's what America First means. America First is the translation into English of Deutschland über alles. And its meaning in 1940 was that Americans, together with Nazis and other Europeans, should form a protective wall which will keep all the nasty brown and people out. That's what Lindbergh says. That's what America First means. So if we were in a period of politics of eternity, we might imagine that our president would refer with affection to monuments of the 1920s and 1930s, monuments which celebrate the racial purification of American cities. That's the kind of thing that you would expect to happen. The other kind of thing that you would expect to happen would be fiction, would be the arrival of fiction. The leader comes from fiction and he brings fiction. What Mr. Putin did, and tell me if this sounds familiar, what Mr. Putin did was he filled the public sphere with information that wasn't true. Then he blamed the reporters and said they were purveyors of fake news. That very term, by the way, fake news, has existed in Russian and Ukrainian for about a decade. Like so many other nice things, it has come to us from Russia, right? So you do that, and then you rule from confusion. And what you do with government is that you give government problems that it cannot solve to teach the population that government can't do anything. So what is that like? Well, I already mentioned Make America Great Again, right? So the answer of when America was great was when we were teenagers. Unless you're a teenager, I realize that's an important proviso. So government cannot actually make people young again. I'll give you a more serious example. Most white voters for Trump believe that racism against whites is a bigger problem than racism against blacks. If you believe that, right, you will also believe that government is powerless because government cannot solve fictional problems. Or consider the policies that we actually have in front of us. The two major policies, aside from the propagation of fiction, are tax regression, that is, rich people pay fewer taxes, and the removal of health care. These are policies where, if they don't pass, that's an argument for how government can't really do anything. If they do pass, they make the situation of critical Trump voters worse than it already was. That is, they increase the reservoir of emotion, anxiety, and fear, which can be used to fuel the politics of eternity, where the same thing happens over and over again, where politics is not about doing something better for everyone for the future, but politics is instead over and over and over again about how it's the Muslims, how it's the blacks, how it's the Mexicans, how it's the enemies, right? How it's the enemies here. If there were the politics of eternity in America, that is how it would feel like. So what I want to suggest here is that whether we like to face it or not, I mean, there are a lot of conclusions from this. We don't like to face the reality that America is a half-sovereign country, right? If you're American, I mean, if you're not American, you probably have cooler emotions about it, or it's pretty clear to see. But also, I'll look at it that way. From the rest of the world's point of view, we're a half-sovereign country now, because someone else has messed around in our elections, right? We've done it to other people before. It's happened. It's like everything. I mean, everything happens in America, Americans say this has never happened before, which is almost never true. It's happened before, but it hasn't happened to us. Alexander Hamilton worried about it, right? He wrote about it in Federalist 88, but it's never happened. from the point of view of the rest of the world, we're now a half-sovereign country. It's taking us a while to soak that in, right? But it's the case. The fact that we're a half-sovereign country, or the way that we're a half-sovereign country, the way that we're shifting from an idea of the future is automatically good to an idea of constant manufactured emergency. I mean, have you noticed that no one expects the government to do anything now? Right? We're only a year in. No one expects the government to do anything. I mean, you may think it's fine, the government shouldn't do things. Okay, it's a coherent idea. You may think the government should do things, but either way, nobody, Democrat, Republican, actually expects the government will make policy. What we expect from the government is our daily dose of outrage. That's what we expect. We expect the daily dose of emotion, which allows us to say, you're the enemy, you're the enemy, you're the enemy. That allows us to say that our fellow Americans are the enemies, because that's what the politics of eternity is like. The constant manufacture of artificial crisis, which makes talk of reform impossible because we are constantly outraged about the enemy within, right? So where am I going with this? Where I'm going with this is that 100 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, whether we realize it or not, we are in a moment of counter-revolution. A moment of counter-revolution where the counter-revolution is this going around and around and around again with the outrage, but without policy, where there's no idea of the future. And which revolution is this counter-revolution against? It's not against the Russian Revolution. It's not against the Russian Revolution. It's against the words that Brad cited at the beginning. It's against that. It's a counter-revolution against the American Revolution. That's where we are in 2017. Thanks.
So Professor Snyder is ready to take some questions, and we have a microphone, and I'm happy to take that round. I do want to say also that Professor Snyder is willing to sign copy. I know I've seen several of you. I've seen at least one stack actually. So he can sit up in the foyer on one of those tables, and we should also have some copies of.
On Tyranny.
Do we have On Tyranny?
Yeah.
We do have some copies of On Tyranny. And also I want to mention that afterwards we have a small reception in the building next to the theater. If you go through the seat and gallery, you can get there. So
yeah. So maybe, all right. So yeah, if you guys, I'm going to answer questions. If you want to stay and ask questions, if you want to go, like. You can take cookies as you go. Like I'm not, I'll just look away if you do that. So I'm going to stay and answer a few questions if you want. If you don't mind just telling me your name before you ask the question. And I think Brad's going to go around the microphone. Hey. I see you.
Thank you so much for coming, Professor Snyder. I loved your comments. I'd like to know where you place China in this discussion.
Yeah. So I have only one interesting thing to say about China. You probably have others. So let me start in a way where Brad started. What is democracy? What's democracy good for? We have a lot of things that we like to say about democracy. I mean, we think of ourselves as a democracy. We think of democracy as being a form of freedom. That's all fine and good. But the bedrock important thing about democracy is that democracy is a succession principle. The United States of America is a republic, and it's a republic which has a democratic succession principle. The reason why, don't worry, I'm going to get to China. I know, like it sounds like I'm not, but believe me, it's going to come down on China. The succession principle is democracy. So when you vote, which I hope you all do, when you vote, the vote that you're voting is not about the vote now. It's about the next one, right? Because if there wasn't going to be a next one, you wouldn't vote now. You vote because of the next vote. You vote, and the nice thing about democracy is that it accepts that we're all flawed. So we vote and we make mistakes, God knows, and then we blame those mistakes on the people we elected, and then we vote again, right? And so what democracy does is that it turns human fallibility into history, into time. Democracy produces time. And that's if you're going to have a state that's going to continue, you have to have some principle like that, which makes people take it for granted that the country which has existed is going to continue to exist. And democracy does that. It's almost a form of magic. And so when you persuade people, like if you take a democratic republic like the US, and you persuade people that democracy is going to count for less, you're not just endangering democracy, you're also endangering the republic. Because the republic doesn't have any other means of producing time besides regular elections. Now, this is China. So the interesting thing about China is that the Chinese are trying to solve this problem, right? So the challenge to all authoritarian regimes is how do you continue yourself beyond the particular leader that you have? And the Chinese have tried to arrange their party in such a way that there will be rules about who gets to the top and how long you can be there. And what China in 2016, 2017 shows us is that that's hard. That's hard, no matter how disciplined you are and how disciplined people are, the person who gets to the top is then going to try to bend the rules. And this reminds me of something that I should have said about Russia. Russia has two basic problems, which are worth watching out for because they're problems that we could also face or we're getting towards facing. The first is oligarchical impotence. If you allow too much wealth to be concentrated in too few hands, and those too few hands are the same ones who hold the lever of power, then change becomes impossible, right? If the kleptocrats who have the money are the same ones who have the power, then change becomes literally unthinkable. Because for Russia to become a rule of law state would be for the people who run Russia to lose their jobs. So it can't happen. The other problem that Russia has is the problem of succession, right? Because when Putin comes to power in 2012, they not only fake the elections, but they say that they're faking the elections, which means that you no longer have democracy as a succession principle. People will vote in Russia, but no one believes in it anymore, right? And when you get to that point, it means that the state itself is threatened. Psychologically, that's one more reason why Russia has to have this politics of eternity, because you're not allowed to think about the fact that there can't be domestic policy. And you're not allowed to think about the fact, here's the big unsayable thing in Russia. Putin's going to die. I don't wish him that. It's not that but everyone's going to, as far as I know, right? But what you can't say is we don't know what's going to happen next, and that uncertainty about the future is what means that you have to go into this politics of eternity, where everything is about the constant production of emergency. Okay, so I had my one little thing about China, and I sort of surrounded it by a bunch of other stuff. Okay.
Good evening, Professor. My name is John Berger. To what extent do you see the Patriarchate of Moscow cooperating or being used in this counter-revolution? And are there any elements of resistance in the Russian Orthodox Church to it?
Yeah. So inside Russia, as I see it, and there are people here who follow this more closely than I do, but inside Russia, I see the big challenge, Putin's big challenge, Putin's self-assigned big challenge, as making red and white into one history. That is, making the revolutionary and the counter-revolutionary into one history, into one Russian unity, without seriously considering the history of either, right? So we have this model in Europe and the US, very imperfectly followed, I know, where you have something like, say, the Holocaust or slavery, and you commemorate it by trying to understand it first. Whereas what Putin seems to be trying to do is to say, we don't need to contemplate either the history of the Cheka or the history of the whites. What we need to do is somehow embrace them both into some bigger story, right? And that we're going to treat it all as Russia. And then what follows from that is, if you or I or anyone sees any tensions in Russian society, it's not from Russian history, because everything magically goes together. Those problems, those tensions have to come from the outside. They have to come from the malevolent West somehow. So, to answer your question as you pose it, of course, when Ilyin was reburied, right? He was buried under. Okay. This kind of makes it interesting. Ilyin was reburied at a monastery, where, with the presence of the highest authorities of the Patriarchate, in a place where thousands of Soviet citizens, not them, their ashes were interred during the Great Terror of 1937 to 1938. He was being brought by a president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, who was presenting himself as Orthodox, but who was in fact a former KGB officer. These things are being presided over under the Russian national anthem, which was previously the Soviet national anthem. And Putin's best friend in the Orthodox Church, as you probably know, is also the person who wrote the best-selling book in Russia in 2012, is a monk who says that yes, there was collaboration with the Soviet Union, but but the terror wasn't such a bad thing because those were good Russian patriots. So what's happened with Ilyin is an example, I think, of how these two, what you might think of as two contradictory things, the history of the revolution and the history of Christianity or the history of Orthodoxy, are brought together, they're forcibly brought together without any consideration, right? I find this very striking. So Ilyin thought of himself as a Christian. Ilyin thought that former KGB officers should not be allowed to vote or hold high office in a future Russia. But Putin, who is a former KGB officer and holds the highest office in Russia, is the same person who brought Ilyin's body back and had it interred. This is how I see it. That the hope in Russia is to make revolution and counter-revolution somehow go together without confronting either. And I think today is a good example of how difficult that is, because they don't actually know how to commemorate today, right? They don't have any notion of what to do with today. I mean, so we get to come here and talk about America, right? There were some up here somewhere. There was somebody.
Hi, my name is Lloyd Miller, and in this politics of eternity, the hierarchy you describe places the middle class at the bottom, which seems to imply that now the oligarchy and the impoverished suddenly are on the same side of this dichotomy. And to some extent that makes sense because perhaps the impoverished believe change is not possible at all, and the oligarchy has a clear interest in change not happening.
Yeah.
But what else do you see as binding those two groups, the impoverished and the rich?
Okay.
In this dichotomy.
Yeah, it's in this scheme, which I'm now like thinking out, right? I mean, these terms. It's not like this idea of eternity and inevitability. I just made this up. These are ideas that I'm trying to use to make sense of the world, because I'm deeply convinced that we're moving from one unfreedom to a worse unfreedom, and I'm trying to find the ways to categorize this so we can see it, so we can do something about it. So I don't have it all worked out, but it seems to me that the way that the politics of eternity works is that it persuades the people who are the poor. It persuades the poor that the question is not their own advancement, but the first question in politics is who the enemy is, which is what Carl Schmitt says. So the leading thinker, the leading Nazi legal thinker, Carl Schmitt, says several things that are very important for fascism then and now. And one is that politics begins with the definition of friend and enemy, which is something that Ilyin believes and also cites. Ilyin says politics begins with the definition and the elimination of the enemy. Begins with that, right? So not with policy, not with doing something for citizens, but it begins with the definition of the enemy. And it's a free definition, it's a free choice, it's arbitrary. It doesn't have to be the actual enemy. It doesn't have to be somebody who's actually doing anything to you. It's that's how politics begins. The person who has power is the person who gets to define who the enemy is. And so in the case of Russian politics of eternity, I think the way it works is that you accept the pain of sanctions because you were convinced, wrongly, that there is some sense to this struggle with the West or with the United States. You were convinced incorrectly that Americans are all hopped up with anger about Russia and fighting Russia and think about Russia all the time, when in fact, as we know, that's pretty much the last thing which is on Americans' minds until at least very recently. Whereas in the United States, I think it works mainly with race. So in the United States, what you do is you become convinced that it's fine for me to suffer so long as the people I don't like suffer more. And that's a very deadly and self-perpetuating form of politics. It's okay if I lose my health insurance because I think somebody else is going to suffer more. It's okay if the rich get released from the estate tax because I think that's going to make the people I don't like suffer more than me. And so it's not populism, right? Populism way back when, populism is a very bad name now, but populism way back when actually was an idea which said that we should change policy so that poor people do better. Populism in the 19th century United States said we should actually change the rules of the game so that the elites do worse and other people do better. That's not what Trump and Putin do, right? What Trump and Putin do is something else. They make promises to people, but the promise is not that we'll have a policy which lifts you up. The promise is we will help you feel good about who you hate, right? That's what we're going to do. We're going to help you loop back around. Politics is going to be a daily or weekly spectacle where we help you understand who you don't like. Because politics begins with the definition of the enemy, right? This is how it works. And so if I can get you convinced, right? If I can get you convinced that government, which people in America believe, right? So surveys in rural Minnesota and Wisconsin show that people in the countryside think that government mainly benefits people in the cities. They think their taxes are benefiting the cities, which is an empirical matter not true. People in the red states think that they pay more taxes, which is just as an empirical matter is not true. The way that the American federal government works is that the blue states subsidize the red states and the red states complain about it. That's the way the American federal government works. But people believe, if you believe that government mostly helps the other guy, you'll accept pain if you think that's going to hurt the other guy more. And then you get into this politics which is not about everyone going up together, but this politics of how much other people lose. And that's what I think this shift feels like. When you shift from going towards the future to you shift towards this struggle, right? Where politics is an everyday struggle. And what the leaders do is they help you define who the enemy is. Puerto Rico's the enemy, they don't deserve our help, right? Why should Puerto Rico get the help of hardworking Americans? Whereas in fact, Puerto Ricans paid the taxes that helped rescue Texas, but why does that matter, right? There's somebody else. African-American athletes are sons of bitches, right? Because they are, they just are, and that's what we're going to say. That's going to be the policy of the United States government. Mexicans are rapists, right? We're going to help you know who your enemies are. That's what government's going to do. So I think that's how it works in the US. Again, this is something which is just shaping up before our eyes, right? Although, of course, it's much like what Andrew Johnson told Frederick Douglass. There got to be some students, like you raise your hands and there we go. Oh, look at that. Look at that. Okay.
So like when people usually talk about this election, they just talk about like the different factors like economics, racism, Hillary Clinton herself. So like if you take Russia out the equation, like do you think Trump still wins the election or even like makes it past the primaries?
Okay. So no, but I want to start somewhere else. I think it's really important to start with how we were susceptible to all of this. So we were susceptible, I think, you probably have some ideas too. I think we were susceptible because rates of inequality in the United States have become like Russia. We encountered them in about 2012, 2013. In terms of the amount of wealth that's held by the top 1%, we in Russia are out there alone. I think that, and we know that inequality leads to social immobility. And so there's a really good recent study by this guy, Raj Chetty, where they actually show that it's not just that Americans think that their kids aren't going to do better than they are. It's that they're right to think that. If you were born in 45, you had a 90% chance of making more money than your parents. If you're born in 84, it hits 50%. And after that, it just gets worse, right? When people don't think they're going to do better as individuals or families, it's harder for them to believe in these stories of progress, and it's easier for them to believe in these things that loop around. What does it feel like not to be socially mobile? I mean, it feels like you're sick because you are. So the strongest predictor of a Trump vote in 2016, even stronger than uneducated white male, was do you live in a county where there was a health crisis? That's the strongest predictor of a Trump vote. So in Scioto County, Ohio, which is close to where I'm from, which was ground zero of the opiate epidemic in the United States, the shift from Romney to Trump was 30 points. Every county in Pennsylvania, which shifted from Obama to Trump, every one has an opioid crisis. Every county in Ohio, where Trump did much better than Romney, except for one, Hamilton County, every county in Ohio has an opiate epidemic, right? Which is the sharp end of general health crisis in the United States. And if you are sick, and especially if you were an opiate or a heroin addict, it's very hard to think about the future, right? Your time loops around. So there's student loans. More Americans have student loans now than ever in history. And economic inequality affects students all the way down, like all the way down to the age of 4. You can already see the differences in how students test, based not just on wealth and poverty, but on the inequality of the place that they're from. So these things make us vulnerable. The experiment in political advertising, where you create a new medium called the internet, which more people are going to watch than television, but you're not going to regulate it. Like that, we did that to ourselves. So the Russians exploited it, but we did that to ourselves. And then, of course, speaking of things that the Russians exploit, there's no way that Trump can run the kind of campaign that he runs without racism in the United States. It's impossible without that, because you can't claim, that we're going to make America great again just by defining like who the real Americans are, which is his message, without the background racism in the United States. So I want to say all that first, because assuming that like I'm now an American talking to Americans about America, we can't start from all the stuff that the Russians did, right? They did a lot of stuff, and it was pretty intelligent. I mean, they're way out front than we are, and we were unbelievably naive about them. And there are ways in 2016 that our naivete met their technique, like, for example, McConnell. So, in March 2016, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says that Obama doesn't get to appoint a Supreme Court justice, thereby breaking with one of the most important conventions in the politics of the United States. In June of 2016, Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, meeting closed caucus with other Republican members, here's Representative McCarthy say he thinks Trump is funded by Russia. And Ryan's response is, we have to keep this in the family. In other words, the family is more important than the country. September 2016, McConnell, when informed by the heads of all the American intelligence agencies that Russia is in fact intervening in the US elections, McConnell's response is, I don't believe it, and we're not going to do anything about it, and if Obama mentions it, I'm going to treat it as partisan politics, right? In other words, blocking the first African-American president from doing anything in his last year in office is more important than stopping a threat to the sovereignty of the United States of America, right? It's at that point where our racial preoccupations, which make us, among other things, naive and self-centered, open up a huge field of terrain for a foreign actor, right? So I tend to think we have to start with ourselves and figure out what we did wrong. I mean, so I want to say that all before I say the answer to your question is, I don't think Trump could possibly be president without the Russians, because without the Russians, we would never have heard of him. Without the Russians, he would be a failed real estate developer. He'd be nothing. Without the Russians, there wouldn't be Celebrity Apprentice, right? The role of Russians in his life goes all the way back to the 1990s. If it weren't, after 2004, they were the only place he could get money, because remember, he is an uncredit-worthy bankrupt. American banks don't lend to him. No banks lend to him, right? So if it's not for the Russians, he doesn't even exist. And if he doesn't exist as a media figure, there's no way he becomes president of the United States. And even abstracting away from that, this race was so close, that I assume that without the massive technical help that he had from the Russians, that he couldn't have become president. So I think Clinton would have won without the Russians. But even though I think that, I think Americans have to start with America and not with Russia. Okay, there are a bunch of other students.
How's it going, Professor? Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Do you think we're already close to an oligarchy? I know you spoke briefly on that. Now, there's a lot of power, at least in Russia, and sooner we're going to get there, that most of the power is centralized with the super wealthy in Russia. My question is, as you may know already, that there are 6 main umbrella companies here in the United States, or I believe the United States, I don't know if they go international, but 6 umbrella corporations that own about 3/4 of the consumer market, such as MSNBC, CNN, NBC Studios, ABC, etc. Do you think we're already getting close to an oligarchy ourselves in the United States of America?
Yeah. I mean, let me start. The media is a really good example of how concentration creates problems, right? So people who want to defend inequality or wealth concentration usually say things like, well, it doesn't matter how much wealth there is at the center, so long as everybody has something. And that's actually not true. inequality or concentration has effects in and of itself, and the media is a good example. So one way that we're becoming like Russia is that in Russia, there are basically, there are 7 or 8 television stations that matter, and they're all controlled by the government, which is to say they're all controlled by the particular oligarchical clan, the Putin clan, which happens to run the Russian government. The US is not there yet, but we're trending that way, right? Whatever everyone thinks about CNN or Fox or MSNBC, it's not such a great thing that we have so few media corporations. And in particular, here's the sharp example. In 2008, after the financial crisis of 2008, all the newspapers went bankrupt, right? In 2009, every day on average, 40 reporters were laid off in the US. That basically meant the end of regional and local news in the United States of America, which is a very bad thing if you happen to live in Oklahoma or Nebraska or Wyoming or Ohio or West Virginia. If you don't happen to live on the coast or in a big city, that's a very bad thing because the television news, whether it's CNN or Fox, it doesn't matter. The television news is not actually American news. It's news about Washington, New York, Los Angeles, and the only time Oklahoma ever gets on that news is if there's a hurricane. And I wish I was exaggerating, but I'm not. That's the way it is. If you're in the middle of the country and you're in a sports bar and you're watching CNN, you're going to only see yourself if there's a hurricane coming down your street. That's it. That's the only time you're going to see yourself. And that's a big problem because when there isn't local and regional news, then people forget that there's such a thing as reporters in journalism, and they start talking about the media, right? Because the news that's far away is in your mind, it feels close to the news that's fake, right? It makes, if you get rid of the regional news, you're getting rid of the barrier to the fake news and the conspiracy theories. And that's unfortunately what happened in the US. We need to have 200 regional newspapers. And I mean, I think what we should have done in 2009, if we could have spent 0.000000001% of what we spent bailing out the banks, and we could have rescued all the newspapers in the United States and given them 15 years to adjust the internet. And then things, I think, in the United States would be very different than they are right now. But I mean, I just mentioned the media because you mentioned media companies, but in general, yes. I mean, it's a problem that all the increase in wealth in the United States since the 1970s, if you take out Medicare and Medicaid from the picture, which some people would like to do, if you take Medicare and Medicaid out of the picture, all of the wealth gained in the United States since the 1970s is in the top 1%. That's not a good picture, right? That's not a good picture. And most of it is not in the top 1%, but in the top 0.1%. And in fact, most of it is not in the top 1.1%, but in the top 0.01%. And that way we are very much like Russia, and that has political consequences. Think of the way that Mr. Trump ran his campaign, very intelligently. Mr. Trump answered your question in the affirmative. Mr. Trump said, he didn't use the word oligarchy, but what he said was, we are already in an oligarchy, right? He says, Hillary Clinton has her oligarchs, they're just behind the curtain somewhere. But what Mr. Trump says is, I'm your oligarch. Look at me, I'm your oligarch, right? And people bought the argument that like let's remember he doesn't actually have any money, but he presented himself as being an oligarch, and that argument only makes sense if people already think they're living in an oligarchy, right? So yeah, I mean I worry about this. I mean, before 2016, I said that we were a democracy with oligarchic features. You know, I worry that that's flipping around. That we're getting close to being the other way around. Yeah, there are students all over. Students. I know you guys probably have things to do. How about we take 3 more questions? Yeah.
I'm Alex Karen.
Hi.
Thank you for coming. I guess the obvious question is, what do you think it would take to stop the path that we're on?
Yeah. So there are a lot of things that we can do as individuals. I always like this talk. You know, talks like this I worry about, where I try to talk about only the way things are, because then it can sound like there's nothing that we can do, which is not my view at all. There are lots of things that we can do as individuals, no matter how far along we think we are on this path to tyranny or oligarchy, or even if we think things are honky-dory in the United States of America right now, which is a sentence I rarely hear. There are a lot of things that we can do as individuals which make a huge difference. The way the politics of eternity works is it first knocks down our defenses and persuades us that nothing is possible. It overwhelms us with the bad news. That's what it feels like. Like the news cycle is like a battering ram, which hits you over and over and over and over again, and you think, well, what can I do? What can I do? This is all overwhelming, right? But there are, of course, lots of really easy things that we can do which make a lot of difference, and that's what On Tyranny is about. So, I mean, lesson one, recognizing that you're in an extraordinary situation, for example. And then going back to this question, oops, I lost him. The camera can't tell, but he's not there anymore. Going back to the question about, right, the oligarchy guy's gone, right? Okay. With the press, there are things we can do. If you, instead of going to Facebook, you guys know what Facebook is, right? It's like this, you know what Facebook is? Okay. Platforms are very generationally calibrated, and for all I know, you guys are using some kind of telepathy. Look, from week to week, it changes. My son thinks that Instagram makes his grandmother appear instantly, right? But he's like, he hasn't actually used the internet yet. So, no, that's a true fact. That's true. Okay. So even with things like the media, if we first go to The Guardian or the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times or the Washington Post or whatever newspaper we like that actually employs reporters, and we first read that and then post their stories on Facebook, rather than letting Facebook pump to us the thing that Facebook thinks we want, if we reverse that, like if millions of us do that, that changes the way Facebook looks, and it helps the reporters, the people who are actually doing a job, as opposed to the vast majority of the media, which is just retransmitting junk all the time. That's a simple thing. We can remember to do that at breakfast. First, I read the newspaper, then I post an article that I liked by a real reporter, right? And that actually makes a difference if we do it. There are little things like that which make. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it because that's there's a whole book about it. But there are little things that we can do. As a matter of policy, it's very, I have two big ideas which are totally unoriginal. The first, because they're in the Declaration of Independence. The one is the pursuit of happiness, which means the possibility of social advance. We have to live in a country where people can imagine a future which is better than the present. And what, by the way, this is one of the many things which is on you guys. What that future looks like is on you. As far as I'm concerned, my generation has blown itself out telling you that everything's going to be fine. It's up because I think it is really up to you to figure out what the America that is better is going to look like in 5, 10, 15 years. But in general, it's very important, I think, that people have the sense that their lives can get better, right? Which means that you have to have things like, the main things that countries have where people feel less anxious than we are, right? So countries with comparable average income, normal countries, okay? I'll just say that. I'll be an American exceptionalist for a moment. Normal countries have paid vacation, health insurance, pensions, good public education, right? Normal countries have all of those things, and that reduces the level of fear and anxiety that people experience on a day-to-day basis. It reduces a level of fear and anxiety that can then be politicized. It changes the way people go through life. If they know that there's a pension at the end, if they know that when they're sick, they can go to a doctor, if they know their kids have access to public education, if they know they're going to have vacation that they can look forward to, it changes the way people live. Americans don't have that, and that's totally abnormal, by the way. Everybody else has that. Everybody has that. Go a couple hundred miles north to Canada, they've got it. Go to any European country, they have those things in some variant. We have them because we choose not to have them. And those things allow people to have a sense that that things can get better. There are other things like having labor unions, right? In the 80s, we disabled labor unions. And if you work, you guys, people who work know this, but that means that the marginal return to labor, the gap from the marginal return to labor and wages in this country has grown and grown and grown and grown from the mid-80s to now. Wages have flattened off, even as productivity has gone up. What Economics 101 tells you is that wages should follow productivity upwards, but they don't. Not without labor unions. If you don't have labor unions, then the gap just grows and grows, right? So, there are things like that. So, pursuit of happiness, one thing, and then democracy. I think democracy is actually a really good idea. Not because I think America is democracy in America and rah-rah, and not because it's some ideology that we should be sharing around the world. No, I just actually think that people being able to vote leads to better outcomes, right? I think it would be a good thing if there weren't so much money in politics. It would be a good thing if there weren't voter suppression. It'd be a good thing if there weren't gerrymandering. It would be a good thing if we actually had one person, one vote in this country, which we don't. which we don't. I mean, we just don't. And it's a bad thing, by the way, for the people who benefit from the lack of democracy. Because if the way you come into power is the lack of democracy, the way you make policy is to make your country less democratic, because that's how you came to power. If the rules are fair, then everyone competes on policy. If the rules aren't fair, then the people who benefit most from the unfairness try to make the unfairness work. So I mean, those are two very simple things, which we talk about a lot, but which I think, as macro policy would be good. Okay, I'm going to take two more, because I know you guys have, you have to study and stuff.
My name is Matt Decaus. Just had a question. It makes sense to blame Russia, but it seems to me from the talk you just gave that all they did was essentially stack the odds in their favor the best they could within the confines of the current American system. Is it misguided to see this not as Russia's success over us, but as a failure of our leadership and our current system?
Yeah. So I guess it kind of depends on whether you're looking at it from the point of view of moral responsibility, or whether you're trying to look at it as an analyst. So if we're looking at it from moral responsibility, if we're American citizens talking about the American political system, then we have to start with us. We can't say, well, those nasty Russians, they did these terrible things, it wasn't our fault at all. Of course it was our fault. I mean, I've even left, I've left aside the problems of the Clinton campaign and and the problems of the Obama administration, which I'd also be happy to talk about. These are things that, these are things we did to ourselves as Americans. We have to say we opened ourselves up to this, right? But if you're an analyst, right, if you're actually trying to figure out the world, if you're not talking morally as a citizen of one country, but you're trying to figure out how the world now works, it is very significant that one power can now mess around in what the Russians nicely call the psychosphere of another power and perhaps change important outcomes like the election, right? I mean, they tried it in France, they tried it in Germany, and they support the far right in France and Germany with consequences, although those people didn't actually win. So it depends on whether you're saying is it a moral question or is it an analytical question? Because if it's an analytical question, it's obviously both. And interestingly, I mean, this may be relevant to your question too. Interestingly, I don't think the Russians thought it was going to work. Like they thought they were making trouble, but I think both they and Mr. Trump were quite surprised by what actually happened. And one sign of this is the silence of the bots. Like the bots are now back and they're attacking Mueller and all this stuff. But for the 72 hours or so after Mr. Trump won, there was a kind of silence of the bots because I don't think they were actually prepared for that scenario. I don't think it's the same with his acceptance speech. Like clearly no one actually had thought through the possibility that this could actually happen, right? There was a strange consensus, I think, in Moscow and Washington, like, yeah, we're going to mess with you as much as possible, but we don't actually. And then so now there's a funny way, like, did the Russians win? They won in the sense that we lost, right? I mean, they're very happy. That's clear. Like, this makes them feel good. This makes them feel good. But the way that they win is it goes back to this question. I lost him too. It goes back to the question of the way this new politics works. They're willing to take a hit, right? It hurts Russia to do this to us. Their idea is that it hurts us more. So there's now a new sanctions law, right? Passed 99-1 in the Senate, I think. And that hurts Russia. But their idea is that we're hurt more than they are. So it's worthwhile to do this. And so the question is, if politics is a negative-sum game now, and it's all about, you hurting me more than I hurt you, where is that? That means that everyone is going down, right? And so Russia wins, but they win by losing. They win by thinking that we lose more than they do, which might not be true at the end of the day, right? It seems true now. Okay, one more question. Oh, you're breaking hearts, Brad.
Hey, hey, how's it going? I'm Chaz Mayer, and I'm gonna try to word this question as succinctly, as nicely as I can. So, these politics of eternity stuff, it was way easy. Like the way I'm putting it through my brain is that this is way easier to warn people of 2 years ago when the campaign was still going on. Yeah. But I'm trying to work through conversations potentially in my head, but it kind of just sounds like more doomsaying that doesn't sound like any different that like any average person would hear through like the rest of their social media. How would you suggest that we parse what like you're conveying up in our daily lives, aside from like going on this huge tirade that everyone else has done for their own side?
Yeah. No, that's great. So let me say a word about like what this talk was, and then I'll try to answer your question. So I'm trying to talk up here, for you guys on the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution about ideas about time. I'm starting from that. I'm starting from revolution. And I'm trying to say that we may actually be in a moment of counter-revolution without knowing it, that this thing that's happening to us may be much more profound, deep than we think it is. But I'm not saying that these ideas are true, right? Both inevitability, progress, and doom, they're not true, right? They're ideas that we get trapped in. Morally, they're ideas we get trapped in because in each of them we don't have any responsibility. If everything's going fine, we have no responsibility. If everything's going badly, or if the other side is always to blame, we don't have any responsibility. Those are ideas, I'm trying to say. Those are political ideas. And where I think we are, and I could be wrong, maybe 5 years from now this will look ridiculous, but where I think we are is that we're moving from this, the inevitability, to this, the eternity. And my answer to your question is that we have to start by seeing ideas as what they are. Ideas as what they are, and then once we see them for what they are and where they come from, then we have some chance to get around them or get through them or get under them. Because what I honestly think, it's a very simple thought, is that freedom is history. If you can, the only way to act is to say, I'm not a prisoner of this, or I'm not a prisoner of this. I am acting within real historical structures which I try to understand. Some of those structures are these ideas, right? So I have to try to understand these ideas. If I understand these ideas, and I see how they're wrong, I see, for example, how they serve other people, right, and not me, then I have some chance of acting in the world. So, I worry about, I understand your reaction, and I worry about it when I give this talk. I have other talks, which are like a talk about on tyranny, which is all about the stuff that we can do. And I admit, I feel much better at the end of that talk than at the end of this talk, right? But the place this talk was supposed to come down was, this idea is real, but it's wrong. This other idea is real, but it's wrong. What we can do is see ourselves as acting in history, and that's what gives us the freedom to see what we can do and what we can't do. But if we do just say, if we switch from progress to doom, like if we accept that change in the channel, as it's really tempting to do, if we accept that change in the channel, then we miss the chance. So I'm not going to flip it around. Right now, American citizens have a lot more power than they usually do. Right now, because right now we're in a situation where it's not about policy, it's about the rules of the game. It's about the actual regime. The actual regime is fluid right now. It can be changed, which means that for a while, for the next year maybe, next 6 months, year, 2 years, what we do counts much, much, much more than it ordinarily would. Right now is a historical moment. And when I say that people who are in their 20s are a historical generation, this is what I mean. If they just punt, that will make a huge difference, because the time when they're coming of age is the time when people happen to have a lot more power than usually. In an authoritarian regime change, right, you have this much authority in a democratic situation. When the regime change starts, your authority goes way up like this for a while, and then it goes way down if you lose. We're here, right? Whether we post on Facebook or march, or whether we write, or whether we run for office in 2017, matters a lot more than it usually does. And that's where I would come down. It matters right now. If we don't do it, then we end up down here. We end up in this eternity place. At some point, like in Russia today, it will be illegal to march. It will be illegal to have more than 100 Facebook followers. It will be illegal to do the stuff which we can still take for granted, right? We can get there, that's where we're going. We can get there, but we're not there yet. We're here, where what we do matters a lot more than it normally does, right? So this was not my pep talk version of the talk. This was my here's the world we're really in version of the talk, but I do have a pep talk version, and that's on tyranny. All right, okay.
Please join me in thanking Timothy Snyder for this sobering and yet still, I think, hopeful presentation. Thank you.